Now, when I studied slavery in high school, I assumed, the way a lot of people do, that slavery was something that just happened to black people in Africa.
One of the sad things is that we talk in this country as if slavery was something unique to the United States or to blacks and whites. And in point of fact, slavery was one of the oldest institutions among human beings. They go back as far as there is recorded history. And in every single part of the world, Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians. For most of history, people enslaved people who were the same race as themselves for the simple reason that they simply didn't have the resources to go to another continent and take people from another continent and move them en masse someplace else.
Now, slavery could not have happened without the complicity of African chieftains who sold Africans not just to European slavers, but to Muslim slavers as well.
But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent.
Did you know that Muslim slavers took more blacks out of Africa than did European slavers? The Muslim slave trade began centuries earlier and continued long after the European slave trade ended.
Slavery, yes, during the 9th up to the 13th century, slavery was still very much an Islamic phenomenon as compared to the West. Of course, there was ancient slavery in many other societies, but in terms of chattel slavery, in terms of slavery as an institution, that was profitable. That was very much still an Arab Islamic preserve until the West came in sometime from the 15th, 16th century onwards.
Just how extensive was this Arab Muslim slave trade of Africans?
But slavery was a very important part of Islamic expansion in West Africa, and in fact in the Sudan, and from the very earliest period of Islamic penetration into Africa. It started by buying, purchasing slaves and trading in slaves, and then it went on from purchasing to raiding for slaves and capturing slaves deliberately, especially mainly black Africans, and transporting them into North Africa and into Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, and onwards to the Ottoman Empire to Turkey. So slavery was a very endemic part of Islamic interaction with Africa. And in West Africa, the jihad's period of the 18th and 19th century involved massive slave raiding and slave trading. And many of the slaves that were captured and sent and sold and taken into the transatlantic slave trade, most of those who were doing the raiding at the time were Muslim communities. Because they were the dominant tribes. So a lot of that happened. That is not to say that non-Muslim communities were involved in raiding, but the dominant tribes were the Muslim communities that were doing the raiding at the time.
Now, I've heard that Muslim slavers and Muslim slave owners treated slaves better than did European slavers and European and American slave owners. But is that true?
One of the themes I explored in my book is this perception that Muslims treated their slaves much more humanely than the Western slave trade. And what I found out in my own research was that that is not necessarily the case, and that there were very harsh treatments of slaves by Muslim groups. It was just a done deal at the time. And one of the key differences I looked at in my book whereas slaves taken to the West were able to marry and reproduce and have their families, and you can still find large populations of African Americans today in North America, and in the Caribbean, you go to the Islamic world and you find very few black remnants of the slave trade, which was very massive. And one of the reasons is that many of the male black slaves taken into the Islamic world were castrated as eunuchs, which meant that they could not, of course, reproduce. And the other factor is that many of the women were taken as concubines by their slave masters, and they gave birth to mixed races, and they were very much absorbed into the society. So you don't have black slave kind of descendants in the Muslim world as you would in North America. And part of the reason is the castration and the way the slaves were treated.
Now, slavery ended in the West, in America not until after the Civil War. But what about the Arab Muslim slave trade? When did it end? In fact, has it ended?
Slavery persisted in Islamic countries far, far longer than it did in the West. The West abolished slavery long before the Islamic countries ever abolished slavery. And they did so under a lot of pressure from colonial governments and from Western governments and from all kinds of activist groups. And in fact, the Saudi Arabia, for instance, abolished slavery in 1961 or 1960 thereabout, whereas Mauritania abolished slavery in 1981. And these were done on paper, and a lot of it is still being done. In practice, there are still a lot of slaves in Muslim countries. And the Sudan, during the Civil War, there was a lot of slave raiding going on done by the Arab Muslims in the north against the animists and the Christian Africans in the south. So even up to the 90s and this century, there was still capturing of young African men, boys in the Sudan for sale. So slavery continues, even though it has been abolished on paper in many Muslim countries.